Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor and thank you very much for joining us to these live broadcasts on the Car Dealer YouTube channel where we talk to people right across the industry. Now, today I'm delighted to say we're going to be talking about used car values, a topic that has been a constant source of news and debate over the summer. But what's going to happen in the autumn and how are things at the present moment in time? Well, here to answer all of those questions and many more is Rupert Pontin, Director of Insights at Cazana, which is, as you well know, a vehicle data and valuations expert. Now, we're going to be online for the next 20 or so minutes. I've got plenty of questions to ask Rupert, but as this is a live show, do feel free to pop your questions into the comments box and I'll do my best to put them to Rupert. But we'll start with mine. So, hello, Rupert. Lovely to have you on.
Morning, James. Good to see you again.
Yeah, and lovely to have you. I'm sorry, it's Car Dealer Live 101 today, and that may be a bit ominaous, actually. So
yeah,
yeah, it is a little bit. So we'll gloss over that bit. We'll just carry on regardless. Now, the last time I spoke to you was a couple of months ago now, I think. I'm sure you've been very busy since then. I mean, how would you describe the used car market generally since lockdown? Quite a difficult thing to surmise, I suppose, but how has it been?
Well, in some respects it's difficult, but in others it's not. Really, because the market since lockdown went through that early period where very little transactions were taking place. You know, customers weren't able to go to the dealerships and therefore the complete business. But once we got to a point where the dealerships reopened at the beginning of June, we saw really a very, very quick pickup in consumer demand, which was kind of expected. Certainly by me and by us, it was expected because, of course, you've got this period of pent-up demand. In addition to which there had been a period where people had not been able to spend their money in the way that they might well have done. Yes, I understand some people were on furlough, but equally there hadn't been the opportunity to go out and enjoy yourself on social things and so forth. So actually the used car market suddenly became incredibly active. Less so in the early stages for the new car market, but certainly the used car market demand came crashing back in, and all of a sudden the dealers found themselves in a position where, despite having new social distancing rules and having to adopt different ways to service customer requirement and test drives and so forth, actually the market turned really, really well. I think if you're asking whether that has continued, the answer is yes.
I mean, but there have been some pretty unusual trends, though, haven't there? I mean, in the past, you and I have spoken about, small cars and sports cars and even MPVs. So there's been popularity for cars that wouldn't normally be quite so popular.
Yeah. Totally agree, James, and that has continued actually, that has been, we've seen prices increasing around those particular types of vehicles, but also really noticeable that we consider what price range those vehicles are in too. So what we've seen certainly during most of during most of the market activity since the beginning of June has been activity in the in the over 10-year-old marketplace and the sub £10,000 price bracket. Those being the cars that are cheaper, and those being cars where people have been perhaps looking, as we've discussed before, at looking at alternative routes of transport to work, so not wanting to go on public transport. And those more cost-effective cars have given them an easy route into the marketplace, which has been fascinating, and that has continued until recently. So we have seen a slight change in that marketplace. But one of the things, obviously, that has been hampering the market as a whole has been the supply of used vehicles. And in the wholesale marketplace, there has, for certain types of cars, been a shortage, and that has exacerbated some of the wholesale pricing, which in itself has tried to push up the retail pricing as well. One thing I would point out, though, is that the volatility seen in the wholesale market hasn't necessarily been replicated in the retail marketplace. So we have seen retail prices pretty consistently over the period of time increasing, with some ups and downs along the way, and that's kind of supply driven. But we haven't seen some of the excessive peaks that have been reported from the wholesale marketplace reflected in the retail marketplace. You just can't do that. The retail consumer isn't going to walk onto a forecourt one week and say, well, there's £10,000 for that Focus, and then walk back a week later and say, well, actually it's 11.5 now. That isn't sustainable. Whereas you might see that kind of volatility within a wholesale marketplace.
Yeah. We'll come back to supply issues a bit later on.
Sure.
I just want to talk a little bit more about cars at the cheaper end of the market, because when this sort of trend first sort of started, quite a few months ago now, I must admit, in all honesty, I thought it sounded a little bit as though we were trying to label it. People were too scared to use public transport. And I thought, personally, I thought it was a little bit unlikely. But, as people have started to go back to work, we've all seen those photos on social media, haven't we, of empty train carriages. And this really is a thing, isn't it? People are scared about using public transport. And what with the ever-changing government announcements, especially the announcements from yesterday, last night, this reluctance to use public transport really is going to carry on, isn't it? And this cheaper end of the market is probably going to remain hot for quite some time.
Well, that's an interesting point. You're right in many respects, because people don't want to put themselves in an environment where they're travelling with other people and therefore increasing risk of picking the virus up. I think that for many people, the push on that, let's buy a third car or a second car or whatever it is as a commute vehicle, I think a lot of that has already taken place as people have started to go back to work. So what I'm expecting to see is that as we go towards the end of the year, there'll be a stabilisation of demand for those vehicles. There will also be a pickup in the volume of vehicles available, and we will see perhaps a softening of pricing. Now, interestingly, I have last week's data in front of me on a screen just above us, so I will glance away just for a second. But actually, in terms of retail pricing movement over the last week, the older car sector, i.e. vehicles over 10 years of age, has actually seen a drop in average retail price of 3.68%. So perhaps that is a follow-on from the previous week. So perhaps we're beginning to see that area of the market tail off. Now, that doesn't surprise me, because, as I said, there are all those people that have made that decision, not getting on the train, not getting on a bus, or even the train and bus service from their particular area, if they're more rural, actually isn't even running. So they've had to go out, they've addressed that problem, and perhaps we're coming to the end of it. So that's why I see perhaps pricing returning downwards slightly to a more realistic level, perhaps, if you could call it that.
Now, that is interesting, because I hadn't actually thought of that argument, that the people who have made the decision to not use public transport and perhaps buy a cheap car, those decisions were probably made a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago.
A couple of months ago, yeah. And you kind of run out of that. On the other side of it, I will highlight that I heard this morning, I'm part of the Vehicle Remarketing Association, we were having a discussion as part of our board meeting, and there was a comment raised by one of the other directors that highlighted that the number of people that have been issued new driving licenses this year has gone up significantly. I think it's somewhere like, I probably need to check it, but somebody said around 500,000 extra new drivers on the road this year, over and above the normal, and that there is a significant backlog on driving tests. So there are still people coming into that marketplace. Now, you could argue that they may not aim for the lower end of the market. They might want something newer. It depends on the deals and the structure that are in the marketplace, particularly on late plate cars, because certainly in the last few weeks, the vehicles up to sort of 3 years in age are still going up in price. But it is interesting to note that, yes, we've got that group of people that don't want to travel. They've made their decision, bought their vehicle. You do still have this influx of new drivers. And that's something Cazana identified a couple of years back. That would be a trend going further forward as a population increase. But fascinating to see, and I hadn't checked, I forgot to check, but fascinating to see that it had just ballooned in this last 6 month period.
Yeah. I mean, if only the DVSA, or, could actually get through these backlog of driving tests, dealers could actually see these people on their forecourts, couldn't they? I mean, food for thought indeed. Now, just talk a little bit more about value softening. So we've just spoke about the cars at the cheaper end of the market.
Sure.
Are you starting to see just the first signs that the market in the used car market in general is starting to soften? Because a few companies recently have come out and have said that.
Yeah, they have. This is a really difficult one because I'm aware that the new market is firing on all cylinders in September, and halfway point registrations were up, and that's fabulous news. I understand there are supply constraints on new vehicles. In terms of the used car marketplace, retail prices have really been going up all since the beginning of June. The question is, how long can that continue? But certainly in terms of retail demand on the forecourt, I do understand that there's been a bit of a turn down in footfall. There's been a bit of a drop off in the number of online inquiries, and sort of digital marketing has had to work extra hard to keep those leads coming in. Some of that will be attributable to the fact that people are focusing a little bit more on their work life. They've finished their summer holidays. The kids have gone back to school. It's time to give a bit more of a work focus. So perhaps that's had something to do with it. But we also need to take into consideration that this year, Black Swan event, at this time of year, naturally, the used car market tends to begin to quieten down in that sort of deadish period between October and November, whilst people start to think of Christmas. Now, I know we have all sorts of other dynamics that are involved this year, but yeah, I think perhaps we may begin to see a bit of a tail off. I mean, I'm looking at the data here. Basically, anything really from 3.5 years and over has begun to show a decline in average retail price. I'll be very specific about this. The decline in retail price that we reflect here, we do put some parameters in place to take out the extreme outlier movements. I'll come back to that in just a second. So we're looking at a significant volume, more data than you would see through any other supplier of this type of insight. But we are making sure that we're focusing on the bulk of the market trend rather than the odd outlier. So the movements downwards vary between 0.17% for a 3.5-year-old vehicle, which is, that's a small amount, but it is still a slight downward movement. And it ranges up. The two bigger movements are coming towards the older end. So the older part exchange vehicles, 7 to 10 years old, that's moved down by 1.13%. Arguably, you could say, and then through to the older car, which is 3.68%. So we are beginning to see that. I'm not surprised. It's certainly nothing to be panicking about from the point of view of somebody who's retailing vehicles. It's something to watch. But yeah, having seen so many months of retail pricing increasing, it shouldn't be a worrying point.
Yeah, and let's just talk briefly about Cazana and how it does things differently, because the way you operate is a little bit different to some of perhaps some of the older players in the market. Yeah. So could you just briefly explain that for dealers Sure. who don't may have not have used Cazana before or heard of you?
Sure. So from our perspective, we work on a retail back methodology. So what that essentially means is we are working from what a car will retail at to create a wholesale price for a vehicle. The traditional suppliers work from a wholesale price and then make a manual discussion, have a discussion on where you would end up with a retail price. From our perspective, we have no editorial team whatsoever. We collate data from the marketplace as a whole. We see in excess of 20 million data points in the course of a year, which, once they're deduped, drop to 12 million. Then you're talking about 8 million used car sales off that. So we are looking at the whole marketplace. We look at adverts that are shown on dealer sites, not necessarily on retail advertising platforms. We prefer to drive back to the dealer because they will keep their sites up to date more often. So we also work on a real-time basis. So a price you see on a vehicle today through some of our tools and through our APIs, that price might move upwards or downwards tomorrow. And that is because we are working with very, very agile technology to be able to provide the best and most accurate data that I think is available in the marketplace. So we are challengers, we are disruptors to the marketplace. I'm sure we've upset lots of people, but on the same hand, we've also empowered and made pricing and vehicle forecasting very, very transparent.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, let's just return to something we spoke about earlier on, which was about supply and perhaps there has been a shortage. We know that. Generally speaking, are you still seeing dealers still struggling to get the used cars that they want, or perhaps some supply chain issues? Is this still a thing?
Yes, it is still a thing. And interestingly, with yesterday's the announcement in terms of perhaps a tightening of groups of people and so forth, this potentially could become more of an issue in coming weeks. So genuinely, the logistics departments and logistics businesses and the refurbishment businesses and the auctions have had a really hard time of it. It's not that they don't want to sell these cars and get them delivered and bring the next lot in. Because of the number of movements a car requires on site and the number of different people that get in and out of that car, they've had to change their processes immensely. And as a result of that, where you might at a preparation center, move the car 100 yards, somebody else gets in it, it does this and moves again 300 yards, somebody else gets in. You can't do that anymore. So they're having to alter processes and procedures so that it becomes more seamless. But the bad side of that is that because of this sort of distancing and this need to stay apart, if you're a dealer and you've bought a car, actually trying to find a slot to go and get it picked up from the wholesale source, whether that be auction or another wholesale supplier, is actually really, really difficult. So it is taking more time for them to get the cars. Now, we'd started to bottom out on that, I think, and things have got an awful lot better. It'll be interesting to see what challenges they face over the coming weeks if we see further measures to keep people apart and further lockdown. Because, we're coming towards a period where naturally more vehicles will come into the marketplace off the back of a good September month. Used car sales very, very high. So we could see some more difficulty with this over the coming weeks.
Yeah. And the irony of all of this is that some auction companies, they've really put some proper practices in place, really changed the way they operate, and they're starting to open their doors again. And and of course, you're right. The situation as it is now could be totally different by the beginning of next week, couldn't it? So
it really could. Yeah, and this is the difficult thing. So it's an ever-moving feast, really. I think you've got to give them 10 out of 10 for doing the very best that they can. I know it's frustrating from a retailer point of view. If you've bought 15 cars on a platform, you can't get your hands on them for a week. But I've got to say, it's certainly through what I know, through what I see through the VRA, these guys are doing absolutely the best they can to try and make it as seamless as possible. I mean, from their point of view, they work on a volume basis. That's how they're profitable. They need those cars to be going in and out of the door as quickly as they can. So I do have sympathy for them. Yes, I know it's frustrating. So let's hope it doesn't get worse. Let's hope we can work around it.
Yeah. Lastly, let's just look towards the rest of the year. Now, as you and I both know, and as you've touched upon earlier on, there is a seasonal slowdown with used cars as we get closer to Christmas. What's the likelihood of that decline is going to be a bit more profound? What with furlough ending next month, we've got the B word, which luckily we haven't really been speaking about too much over the past few months, but it's reared its ugly head again. There's going to be some really tough times later this year, and how do you think that's going to impact used car values?
Well, you're absolutely right. We do have some challenges ahead. I think there are two. You hit on the two key ones, and that is the B word. Excuse me. It has been quieting in the background. We are surging towards it, and that will have an impact, perhaps more so on the new car market because of adopting the WTO tariffs. But the used car market, as a result, may benefit from that. We'll have to wait and see. I think the key one there also is furlough. With furlough ending at the end of October, I think it is, and certainly during October there are some changes to the support that will be given. It will be interesting to see whether that actually happens. In an ideal world, and I think some people have talked about it, that the government will extend it. They certainly have done in other European countries, particularly Germany. Although some of the feedback that we've had in the last few days from Bank of England and so forth is that perhaps they're going to be considering changing furlough rules and perhaps supporting certain sectors that aren't able to operate at key levels, and that would be a halfway step. What I genuinely believe is we can't, as an economy and as a country, afford to just step away from furlough completely, because that won't just hurt the automotive sector, it won't just hurt used car sales. It could be devastating for the economy. Not wishing to sound a harbinger of doom or anything, but I think that's a reality. So I don't believe the government will let us get into that position. In terms of used car sales, I think we will see a tail off. It's very difficult to judge it to what level that will be. In terms of used car pricing, we also need to consider that there will be more used cars coming to the market. Certainly the financial services sector expecting a greater level of defleet of vehicles to hit the marketplace. There are a number of factors in the background concerning supply that could see an increase in supply. That aside, even if you have an increase in supply, it's how the consumer feels, it's how the consumer wants to spend the money. Looking at the forecasts you see through trading economics and so forth, one does see that there is still a continual line of improvement in consumer confidence. Let's just hope that that continues. And you know, that forecast is already at that level, bearing in mind that furlough is ending and so forth. So I'm not in a position today where I would say there's going to be a crash in prices. I don't believe that there will be a crash in prices. I do believe there'll be more pressure, but I also believe that the consumer will still have confidence and will still want to change their car.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Perfect way to end. Always a pleasure having you on. Always good to chat, and some fantastic insight there. So thanks very much, Rupert, for coming on.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite, James. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Definitely. We'll definitely be in touch again soon. If you want to be involved in a car deal live just like this one, then please do drop me an email, james.batchelor@blackballmedia.co.uk. I'm back on Friday, but until then, thanks very much for watching, and bye-bye.